Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, and Hearthstone's the game. And today I'm going to be taking a look at all of the brand new cards from the newly announced adventure, the League of Explorers. This is already scheduled to hit this week, which means these cards will be in your collection very, very soon. And I think it's helpful to take a look at all these cards in a little bit more detail, see how good we think they're going to be and whether or not they'll have an impact on the meta, and maybe how good they'll be in Arena, or alternatively for budget decks for beginner players. So I've loaded up the Hearthstone Facebook page where all the cards were dumped immediately following BlizzCon, and we're just going to go through these one at a time in no particular order, specifically the order that the Hearthstone Facebook page listed them in. And that means we're going to start with Animated Armor. This is a 4-mana mage card that has 4/4 in stats, and your hero can only take 1 damage at a time. This card is intriguing to me just because it has an effect that is so downright powerful. Anytime an effect has that much sweeping change on a game, in other words, it could take a Pyroblast and turn it into a ping. I think cards like that have potential because you never know what kind of decks are going to be created around them. Unfortunately, I don't really see a slot for Animated Armor in the current metagame of mage deck archetypes. Even in Freeze Mage, where you need a lot of defensive prowess, it doesn't seem all that good. Tempo Mage, it's not that useful because it's not adding to the board actively. And the stats just aren't good enough for it to replace more standard 4-drops as well, like Piloted Shredder or Water Elemental for mages. I don't really see this one being impactful, but I think as the game continues to grow and cards keep coming out, you'll never know when Animated Armor might be called upon. Plus, it could be pretty insane out of a drop of Piloted Sky Golem and things like that. So, who knows how Animated Armor will be seen. It's not a bad card, but it's probably not a good one either. Up next is Anubisith Sentinel, and I realize now that these cards are in a particular order, that order probably being alphabetical, given the letter A starting each of them. But anyway, Anubisith Sentinel. This is a neutral card. It's 5 mana. Another 4/4 minion, but this time it has a Death Rattle effect. Give a random friendly minion +3/+3. Now, 4/4 in stats is not particularly good for a 5-mana card. In fact, it's pretty bad. But this is an intriguing Death Rattle effect, which means you could essentially get 7/7 in total stat value out of 5 mana, which starts to sound much more appealing. The problem is that Death Rattle effects are hard to control sometimes, and this one is not guaranteed to go off, meaning you don't always have another minion on the board to receive this buff. So it feels like a much worse Dark Cultist, the Priest 3-drop that's a 3/4 that buffs 3 health. So I don't really know that I'm going to see this card in action too often. I think it'll be fine in Arena. In fact, it could be great in Arena, but in Constructed, the effect is too unpredictable and just a little bit too slow. So I don't imagine it being all that useful. Up next is the 4-mana Ancient Shade. This is a 7/4 body, and anytime you play this card, it shuffles an Ancient Curse into your deck that deals 7 damage to you when drawn. So this is one of those cards that's kind of a big body with a downside, something like maybe Fel Reaver. You want to get a high attack minion out really affordably and see if it can hit for a couple turns and essentially win you the game if you're looking for aggressive damage. Unfortunately, at 4 health, this one just dies way too easily. It's far inferior to Fel Reaver. The Battlecry downside isn't that bad. 7 damage randomly. Sometimes you'll never even see that 7 damage. So I'm not too worried about that as the downside. But between the downside and the susceptibility of this health total, I don't see Ancient Shade being useful in many cases. Anything can happen, reminiscent of the Lego Movie soundtrack. This 10-mana Paladin spell summons 7 Murlocs that died this game. So first off, it's a 10-mana spell, which we haven't seen many of, so it needs to be powerful to be worth that mana cost, and it definitely is. Loading up the board with 7 Murlocs instantly is pretty crazy. Now, there are some inconsistencies in this wording that I don't totally understand how it works. Summon 7 Murlocs that died this game could, for instance, mean if you had 4 that died and your opponent had 3 that died, that you summon minions on both sides of the board. That would be bad. I think it's more likely that you summon 7 on your own side if you've had 7 of your own minions that died. That's the only way this card would be any good. And in that case, it is pretty crazy strong to have instant 7 minion board presence on turn 10. Murloc decks tend to run out of steam just because everything is low cost. This might give them like a late game reset button if you put one of these in your deck, that even if you kind of whiff on your Murlocs and you're just straggling into the late game looking for draws and hoping to stay alive, playing an anyfin can happen. Might just be the way that you sneak out a win that you otherwise didn't deserve if it spawns 3 or 4 charge minions with some synergy that allow you to do 10 damage instantly, for instance. So Murloc Paladin is not really a thing right now, but given Murloc Knight's power, I could see this being a viable card if Murloc Paladin does become a thing. It's very slow at 10 mana, but the effect is indeed incredibly strong. So the first legendary that we're going to review, Archthief Rafam. This is a 9 mana 7/8, and the battle cry is Discover a Powerful Artifact. So 7/8 in stats is fine. It's not awesome for 9 mana. It's still susceptible to Big Game Hunter. The battle cry effect gives you one of 3 cards. The first card does 10 damage to a random enemy. I'm trying to make sure I get these right. There's another that gives a minion +10/+10. And finally, there is a third card that summons a full board of 3/3 minions. So 7 3/3 minions. All of which are very powerful 10 mana spells. But the card itself is pretty slow and very susceptible to removal, which means that I don't think Archthief Rafam will have an instant impact on the game, and therefore probably won't see play. Even despite his powerful spells that he summons, that's a 19 mana commitment over 2 turns that doesn't necessarily work. So even though you get to discover those artifacts and choose which one you want, sometimes they just won't be good. I think most people will always pick the one that fills the board with 3/3 minions unless you're way ahead in the game. If you're already way ahead in the game, what's the point of needing this card because you're probably going to win anyway? I'd like to see this experimented with and see it in action, and maybe it will do better than I think, but I'll have to be surprised if that's the case. I think it's just too slow. Up next is the Bran Bronzebeard, another new legendary for 3 mana. This guy is a 2/4 body, and his effect means that battle cries trigger twice. That could be pretty insane. The 2/4 stats is fine for a 3 mana minion. It's not great, but we see a lot of powerful 3 mana 2/4s. And the fact that battle cries trigger twice is nuts. For instance, Dr. Boom would spawn 4 Boom Bots. You can imagine the power that this card holds if you combo it with other Battlecry cards on the same turn. As a turn 3 play, it's probably not going to be that strong because it'll be removed before something happens. But if you build decks around the synergy of triggering Battlecries twice, there's some awfully powerful Battlecries out there that could benefit from multiple triggers. So in the right kind of deck that prioritizes Battlecries, I don't see why Bran Bronzebeard wouldn't fit. He's going to have to carve out a spot, but I think the potential is definitely there. This could be a good card that sees some play in my eyes. Up next is the Warlock card, the 2 mana Curse of Rafam. This gives your opponent a cursed card, and while they hold it, they take 2 damage on their turn. So for 2 mana, you give your opinion a curse card, which is another 2 mana card that triggers 2 damage every time they start a turn. So you're guaranteeing they take 2 damage from this card, at the very least. The other thing is they might have to penalize themselves in tempo by playing that 2 mana curse just to get rid of it. So you're forcing them to make a decision. Do I hold this 2 mana card and continue to take 2 damage? Or do I waste 2 mana just to get rid of this card? It's kind of forcing them to take the same 2 damage penalty that you tend to with life tap. So it's really just a sort of tempo play. It's 2 mana for 2 damage and potential to neutralize the mana expense by forcing it upon them as well. I don't think this card is good enough to see play. The mana gain is somewhat neutral. The damage is low. Most Warlock decks don't really care about 2 extra damage near the beginning of the game. So I think this is a bit of a throwaway card. It's a fun one though, which is really nice. I like to see fun cards, but I can't imagine it's that great. Up next is the Warrior Weapon Cursed Blade. This is pretty crazy because it's 1 mana and it has 2 attack and 3 durability, which is extremely high value for 1 mana. Of course, it does have the downside that it doubles all damage dealt to your hero. So if you just look at the raw stats, this is an insane weapon. A lot of early game minions have 2 health, especially the scariest ones like Knife Juggler or Shielded Minibot. So this would do work, especially on turn 1, because you can just get it out a little bit earlier. I could see people running 1 Fiery War Axe and 1 Cursed Blade just to give them flexibility on mana and tempo in the early game. The problem is the double all damage dealt to your hero. Thankfully, Warriors do have ways to mitigate that and recover health thanks to all their various armor cards. So there might be Warrior decks that do think it's more valuable to trade off some extra damage for the early game tempo that this card offers. So I could see Cursed Blade experimented with and maybe even make some decks. I think it's pretty powerful. Of course, the only problem is that the double all damage dealt to your hero is not only when you're attacking, it's any time that the weapon is equipped, which means you can't hold on to it for too long. You have to spend the charges, or over 3 or 4 turns against an aggro deck that are just piling on damage. So you have to be careful. But I still think Cursed Blade is good enough and viable enough, and I want to try it myself. I think this is a good card. Up next is the Warlock card, a 2-mana Dark Peddler. Battlecry, discover a 1-cost card. Has a stat allocation of 2 attack and 2 health. So that right there is not exciting. 2 attack and 2 health for 2 mana is pretty weak. It's not going to scare anybody with its attack, and it doesn't trade favorably into anything at 2 health. So it really all comes down to the Battlecry here, right? The discover a 1-cost card. I think most people are going to overlook this card, but I'm seeing some potential here because 2 very powerful Warlock cards are in the 1-cost slot, and that is Soulfire and Power Overwhelming, each of which are kind of your burst damage cards. So Dark Peddler might actually be a card that says Battlecry, dig for lethal, or Battlecry, clear a big taunt in a zoo-style deck, because most of those will tend to run a Power Overwhelming or 2, and maybe even a Soulfire on occasion. Which I think means this card is good, because I have a feeling the 3 cards that are going to show up the most are Mortal Coil, Power Overwhelming, and Soulfire, all of which are pretty good cards to have an extra of. It's also nice just for mana flexibility. You can play it on turn 3, and you're guaranteeing yourself a full mana turn. It's fine on turn 2 as well. It's going to be a solid card in Arena. I think it might even see some experimentation in Constructed too. Don't overlook Dark Peddler. I think there's potential in this card. Up next is the Hunter Trap, Dark Trap. And this is a trap that anytime your opponent uses its hero power, this trap will do 5 damage to a random enemy. And I so far think this card is insane. I think it's really crazy. First off, 5 damage for 2 mana is great, right? It's better than a Flame Cannon. It's way better than like Quick Shot or Frostbolt. It has the chance to whiff, right, and hit like a 1/1 minion from time to time, and that won't be great. Other times it has the chance to kill a Sludge Belcher, or just do 5 damage to the enemy face, which is something hunters often love to do. So that's going to be good on average, the actual effect of doing 5 damage to a random enemy for 2 mana. I think that's a win most of the time. But really, just this card existing is good for hunters, because people will have to think about it and play around it, which means you could go an entire game and shut down someone's hero power. Imagine how nice it would be if a warrior is very scared for his life, has like 8 health left, and he wants to hero power to get to 10 to get out of lethal range, but then he's like, oh no, What if I take 3 damage by hero powering? Because 5 minus 2 is 3. I can't risk that. You might deny a priest from healing or a mage from pinging something scary that you have because they don't want to risk that 5 damage. So just the existence of this card actually makes Hunter better in my mind. And when it goes off, it's nice too. So even if you don't run Dart Trap, you might benefit from Dart Trap. And if you do run Dart Trap, I still think it's pretty good. So it'll be fun to watch this card and how people react to it. Up next is the Priest card Entomb. 6 mana spell. Choose an enemy minion and shuffle it into your deck. This is basically a hard removal spell that gets rid of your enemy's minion and eventually gives it to you. So in really, really slow metas where Control Priest is thriving and you need a lot of resources for long fatigue-style battles, hard removal's good, and extra resources to expand the size of your deck are good, which means Entomb would be good. Unfortunately, I don't think Hearthstone has ever seen a really, really slow meta where cards like this thrive. Right now, it's just too slow. It's very bad against aggressive decks. It's far worse than something like Light Bomb, for instance, at the 6 mana slot. So I don't see a place for this card today. It's only going to be good against like Control Warrior or Ramp Druid. But eventually, who knows? I think Entomb is something people will have to keep in mind. Maybe 6 months, a year down the line. It's not a bad card necessarily. It's kind of a cheaper, slower mind control. But right now, it's just not good enough. We'll see. Up next is a really fun card. The 4 mana Elise Starseeker. And this has a Battlecry effect. Shuffle the map to the Golden Monkey into your deck. And it's a 3/5 body. So as a 3/5 for 4, there's nothing particularly exciting about Elise Starseeker. That's a fine stat allocation. It's a Sinjin Shieldmaster without taunt, right? It's a Refreshment Vendor without the heal. It's fine. It's nothing exciting. So with her, it all comes down to Battlecry, right? And this is probably the most fun card in the history of Hearthstone because the map to the Golden Monkey gets added to your deck. And though I can't show it here, the card is essentially a 2 mana cycle card that says add a Golden Monkey to your deck and draw a card. So when you draw the map to the Golden Monkey, you get a card. It's a 2 mana spell. You cast it. It draws you a new card. You're paying 2 mana to cycle a card. But you're also depositing the Golden Monkey into your deck. And then eventually, once you draw the Golden Monkey, he comes to your hand. He's a 4 mana 6/6 taunt, which is incredibly good, by the way, that has an effect that reads, change all the remaining cards in your hand and your deck to legendary minions. Which is nuts, right? So, say you have a couple Northshire Clerics in your deck and you're a priest, suddenly those both become Ragnaros, right? You can see the power there. In extremely long, late-game control-style decks, maybe the last 5 cards in your deck all turn into Kel'Thuzad. Something crazy like that is the potential of Elise Starseeker in the treasure hunt that she sets you upon. The problem with Elise Starseeker is that she's very, very slow. You're giving up a little bit on turn 4 because her body is just not that great. The 2 mana card cycle's fine, but it is a little bit of a tempo loss at 2 mana. It's not great to draw the map to the Golden Monkey. It's fine. The Golden Monkey itself is fantastic as a 4 mana 6/6 taunt. That's where you start to gain tempo and value from the Elise Starseeker journey. And the Golden Monkey effect is usually going to be good. Sometimes it will remove great cards and trade them for Blood Mage Thalnos, right? It could turn your Ragnaros into a Blood Mage Thalnos, a direction you probably don't want to go. So even that will have downsides. Who knows where this card falls? It could be amazing in really long, late-game control-style decks just because of the value it offers. It might just be too slow, too weak. On average, the effects might come too late since you have to draw them so much. I don't know where Elise Starseeker falls. I'm certainly going to experiment with her because I think it's so much fun. It's the coolest thing Hearthstone has done yet. So, she might be good, she might not. We'll see. My feeling is she's going to be too slow and not played, if I had to make a gut judgment right now. Up next is the 5 mana Jenny of Zephyrs. Whenever you cast a spell on another friendly minion, cast a copy of it On this one, it's a 4/6 body for 5 mana. That's a pretty decent stat allocation, 4/6. It's not bad at all. I can live with that. 5 attack would certainly be better, like a pit fighter. But 4 attack with this effect still makes this a pretty interesting card. It's basically duplicating any buffs that you put on another minion, which means it might be cool in even cheap buff decks like Spare Parts, but it really is probably going to thrive in Priest or Shaman, where there are a lot more direct buff options. For instance, Wind Fury on this and another card would be nuts. You could get 2 Wind Fury minions all at once. And you could also Rock Biter, right? So you have a like a fire elemental on board and this guy on board. You cast Rock Biter, Wind Fury. Suddenly you have 32 points of damage, something like that. You can imagine the scenarios. Even a priest with Velen's Chosen casting on a cheap 1 mana minion with this card in a single turn, right? So you play Jenny, Northshire Cleric, and Velen's Chosen. That's a 9 mana play, but you have a 6/10 on the board and a 3/7 on the board. It's pretty crazy value. So even though this is a neutral card, I think it's got potential in the right kinds of decks. It's going to be decent in Arena. It's going to be hard to trigger the effect in Arena. So it's really just going to rely on the body. Who knows if it will take off in Constructed, but it's not a bad card by any means. It's pretty strong for a neutral card just because the effect is so powerful. I'd like to experiment with this one. I think it's a good card, but probably not good enough to take over the popular 5 mana slot just because there are so many other strong 5 mana cards in the game. It's just probably not going to supplant the popular stuff right now. Up next is the 3 mana Desert Camel with the most hilarious artwork in the game. This thing is so goofy looking. It's a hunter card, a 2/4 beast with a pretty cool battle cry. Put a 1-cost minion from each deck into the battlefield. So this is kind of like a Hungry Dragon almost for 3 mana. I think that more often than not, hunters will benefit from this battle cry. Most decks don't run 1-cost minions, or at least very few, and they try to mulligan for them. So it's more likely for their 1-cost minions to already be out on the board by turn 3. And hunters tend to run more 1-cost minions. So you might play this and get a decent 2/4 body. It's not bad for 3 mana on its own, along with something like a Leper Gnome, giving you 4/5 in value for 3 mana, which is pretty amazing. It's also just thinning out your deck and drawing a card, which is a nice side boost. It's also a beast, opening up beast synergies and turns on turn 4, for instance, with like a Houndmaster. So I think Desert Camel's a great card. I think it's going to see play in beast, mid-range hunter decks. It has a lot of potential. I think it's going to make hunter a little bit better if you're not playing face hunter. Even face hunter, it's not bad just because you're depositing stats onto the board. It's not better than Animal Companion, but it could be run as a side 3-drop to Animal Companion. I just want to see this in games because it's so goofy, frankly. I love this artwork. But I think it deserves a spot anyway. Up next is the Eerie Statue. The 4 mana minion. It's a neutral minion. It's got 7/7 in stats. And it's like an Ancient Watcher in a way. It can't attack unless it's the only minion in the battlefield. So it has to be totally alone on the board if you want to attack with it. That's a really cool effect, by the way. And it's got a good enough stat allocation for its cost that I think this card will see experimentation, particularly in handlock style decks where they want to get big minions like the Mountain Giants and the Twilight Drakes and the Molten Giants onto the board, and they don't always care that they can attack. Sometimes they just want to use the body with a taunt with Sun Fury Protector or Argent Defender, or Defender of Argus, excuse me. So I think this will see play in handlocks. I think it's actually good. It might be even better than Ancient Watcher at the 2 mana slot. It's a little more expensive, but you can still combo it with Shadow Flame really nicely and kill stuff like Dr. Boom or almost anything, Archmage Antonitis. It's great in taunts, and sometimes it'll get to attack in a handlock too, just because they have so much board clear that sometimes it'll be the only minion left, and it will get to ping for 7 for 4 mana. So I like Eerie Statue. I think it's a good card. It won't fit in most decks. It just won't work. But when it does, it's going to be good. Up next is another priest spell. This is Excavated Evil, 5 mana spell. Really cool artwork. It does 3 damage to all minions. That means the enemies and your own. And when it's done casting, you shuffle this card into your opponent's deck. I think this is a pretty interesting card. It's a little bit better than Holy Nova for clearing the board, right? Because it does 3 damage. Some stuff Holy Nova just won't kill. And this will do it for the same mana cost. And it's essentially an anti-aggro card. Because, excuse me, in aggressive decks, sometimes you won't have a board. Like they'll just, like a Zoo Warlock might keep trading into your minions. So Holy Nova's heal won't always have much of an impact on your board. So it does less damage, and the heal sometimes just doesn't do anything because you don't have any minions and it just heals you for 2, which isn't that exciting. Excavated on Evil, on the other hand, will kill more enemy minions for the same cost. And then it takes up a valuable slot in your opponent's deck. Like they could draw into Excavated Evil instead of something else. And there's very little likelihood they'll want to use it as an aggro deck because they're more likely to have low health minions on the board. So not only do you kill stuff with it, it also thickens up your opponent's deck, essentially. Makes their deck worse. They might draw this instead of a Doom Guard, for instance, and they won't want to see it. So when it does both those things, it's a good board clear and ruins their draw. It's a really good anti-aggro card. It's not as good in control matchups. Holy Nova will be a better alternative, but if Priest is looking for a way to counter some aggressive decks in a really fast meta where everybody's just hitting the face, Excavated Evil is an interesting option to me. It might see like 1 Excavated Evil and 1 Holy Nova, for instance, as their 5-drop AoE removal. So keep an eye out for this card. I think it's good. Up next is the 2-mana Hunter card, Explorer's Hat. Give a minion +1/+1, and Death Rattle, add an Explorer's Hat to your hand. So this is essentially a little mini buff that continues to cycle into your hand every time the minion that gets buffed dies. So as long as you have something on the board and it's constantly removed, you can just keep replaying Explorer's Hat over and over again. Unfortunately, +1/+1 for 2 mana is not that exciting in most Hunter decks. It's a pretty expensive, consistent drain on your resources for what I consider a lower return. I would frankly prefer it be +3 attack for most Hunter decks, just because they care more about doing damage than they do keeping their minions alive in the first place. So I guess in control style Hunters that just want to maximize their resources and continue to generate value, there is something here. But most Hunter decks, as they're designed today, Explorer's Hat's just going to be too slow to have a major impact. I don't think this card will see much play. It does give you some options for maybe like a lock and load, Miracle style Hunter, but even then, I still think it's too slow. Up next is a really fun card. I like the art a ton, and I also think it's pretty good. It's the Warrior minion Fierce Monkey. So 3 mana, 3/4 with Taunt. It's really a pretty simple value card. There's nothing exciting about it, but Warriors need good 3-drops, especially with a 3/4 stat allocation, which is kind of the king 3-drop stat allocation. And it's got Taunt too, which is good for Warriors just because it gives them another way to deny early game aggression and set up for the late game where they tend to win. It's really good arena card too, which is something Warriors desperately needed, so it'll be nice to see Fierce Monkey in arena Warrior drafts. It's just a good card. It'll be played. There's nothing wrong with it, and it also adds another option for Taunt Warrior decks, which seem to be a thing to Blizzard, and maybe one day those will finally become a thing to the rest of us. Up next is the 5-mana Ethereal Conjurer. This is a mage minion. It has 6 attack and 3 health, and a battle cry, discover a spell. So it's basically a 6/3 draw a card. Unfortunately, 3 health is just awful. Justicar Trueheart has the same stat allocation for 6 mana, and she sees play, but her effect is permanent and consistently good in long games. This effect is short-term and not as likely to return value because you might just get 3 really bad spells or useless spells. Sometimes, yeah, you'll get a fireball, but even then, it's still a 9 mana commitment. So I don't think this is a good card. It's just too weak. The stats are all wrong. If the stats were switched, it'd be great, but as it stands right now, I don't think Ethereal Conjurer can see play in any given mage type. Has cool potential and neat art, but beyond that, there's not much here. The 7 mana Shaman card, Every Fin is Awesome. This is a spell that gives your minions +2/+2, and it costs 1 less for each Murloc you control. So once again, Blizzard is pretty desperately trying to make Shaman a Murloc class. And who knows, this might be the card that actually accomplishes that. It's pretty fun if you get 4 or 5 Murlocs out onto the board. This is like a 2 mana buff that gives everything +2/+2. Murlocs are already good when they're buffing each other and getting buffed. So, if the Murloc archetype works for Shaman, this card fits. It's really, really good. And note that it doesn't just give Murlocs +2/+2, it also gives your totems or any other minion +2/+2. So, in like really aggressive Murloc hybrid board presence Shaman decks, this could be a good card. It's probably too slow, and Murloc's just not good enough, but if Murloc becomes a thing, this will be a part of it. Up next, the 4 mana neutral card, Gorillabot A3. It is a 3/4 mech for 4 mana. Battlecry, if you control another mech, discover a mech. That's an interesting battlecry, just because it's basically card draw, and you might be able to get a nice mech on curve as needed. You might get a 5 mana mech after this, for instance. You could also just get a really powerful mech, like a nice late game mech that you didn't expect that adds to your curve. Unfortunately, at a 3/4 for 4, it's giving up a lot to other mechs at the 4 mana slot, like Piloted Shredder or even Mechanical Yeti. So I don't know if the stat sacrifice is worth it, just because this is card draw. It's a lower tempo play, and mechs usually care more about tempo and early board presence and pressuring really hard. So I don't know if you want to slow down right at the key turn 4 with Gorillabot. But in budget mech decks, since it is a common, will be easy to access via 1 wing, why not? I could see this card seeing some play. It's a nice solid arena card as well. It's not great in arena, but it will be fine. Up next is the 8 mana Fossilized Devilsaur. It's got 8/8 in stats, and the Battlecry, if you control the beast, gain Taunt. So basically in beast decks, this is an Ironbark Protector. Ironbark Protector is not a good card. Even in Druids, it never sees play. And that has Taunt by default. This only has Taunt when you activate it. It's nice to see big bodies being offered up to beginner players as a part of just a single wing reward, so they can get like a nice big minion in their decks if you're on a budget. But otherwise, I don't think Fossilized Devilsaur is any good. If it was also a beast and was able to trigger beast synergy on its own, maybe it could see play in beast decks, but it's just too susceptible to big game hunter and hard removal. It's a high mana commitment, and it's not doing anything instantly, so I don't think it's good. And then there was Forgotten Torch. This is a 3 mana mage spell. It's very, very good despite the lackluster artwork. This card does 3 damage to anything you want for 3 mana, which is fine. It's a bad fireball, a bad frostbolt. It's an expensive frostbolt, but this right here is where it gets good. Shuffle a Roaring Torch into your deck that deals 6 damage. And that Roaring Torch is another 3 mana spell that does 6 damage. So it's a 9 damage combo for 6 mana, which is exactly what Frostbolt Fireball is. But it only takes 1 slot in your deck and extends the length of your deck, just giving you more burn. So in Freeze Mage in particular, Forgotten Torch could be nuts. It makes you more likely to have a 3rd Fireball in your hand. Not only that, it's a cheaper 3 mana Fireball. So it opens up more combos for burst damage when you need it. Forgotten Torch is really good in Freeze Mage, like scary good. It's going to be in every Freeze Mage deck in my opinion. It's a little bit slower than Frostbolt and doesn't have the freeze effect, but they have room for both. You're going to see Forgotten Torch played. It's a fantastic card. Now there's the 2-mana Jeweled Scarab neutral card. It's a 1/1 beast. It has the battle cry, discover a 3-cost card. So a 1/1 for 2 is terrible. This is basically a Novice Engineer, the 2-mana 1/1, that has a battle cry that draws you a card, the exact same as Novice Engineer, but this card is guaranteed to be on curve. So in other words, you play this for 2 mana, you're guaranteed to have a 3-mana play. That's kind of cool. I get it. I like it, but it's not good. The reason is because turn 2 is generally more important than turn 3 anyway. You need to have stats out on turn 2. You already fall behind. Secondly, it's worse than Novice Engineer in the late game. Because if you draw this on turn 10 and you're digging for value, you don't want to see a 3-cost card. You want to see a 6-cost card or an 8-cost card, right? You want some meat out of that card draw. So this denies you that in the late game. Not to mention, Novice Engineer doesn't get played. It's a bad card. I think this is probably a worse version. Yeah, it has Beast Synergy, but even Beast decks probably don't need this. I don't think Jeweled Scarab is viable at all. I think it's bad. Up next is the 2-mana Huge Toad, another neutral minion. It's got a cute little foot hanging out of its mouth. I thought that was a tongue at first, but it's apparently really huge, given that's a sword and that's a foot. It's pretty cute. This is a 3/2 beast for 2. It's a fine stat. It's a Bloodfin Raptor, but it has a nice little death rattle, deal 1 damage to a random enemy. It's kind of like a Flame Juggler, where the 1 damage triggers later. I think it's a little worse than Flame Juggler. It's definitely worse than Knife Juggler, but it's a beast. So if you're building a beast deck and you need beast synergy, it's a fine card. It's really good in Arena. It's fine and constructed. It's probably not good enough to make most deck lists, but if you're digging for another beast, you need a good one at 2. It's better than the Bloodfin Raptor, right? It's just a straight upgrade to Bloodfin Raptor. So power creep is real. It comes on the back of Huge Toad. Up next is the 4-mana Paladin card, Keeper of Uldaman. This is a 4-mana 3/4. With the battle cry, set a minion's attack and health to 3. So the way I see this, it doesn't say a friendly minion, right? It said set a minion's attack and health to 3. So there's 2 ways to use this card. You could use it to buff one of your own minions, like a Silverhand Recruit, for instance, in Paladin, and make your Silverhand a 3/3, which means for 4 mana, you're going to get a total of 5/6 in stat value, which is pretty good. That's a fine play. 3/4s are fine. Buffing something else is basically giving those stats charge, so you get the benefit of the 2/2 immediately if it's already on the board. That's pretty valuable. It's like a little baby Blessing of Kings attached to this. But also, you can use this battle cry to nerf, or I guess debuff, an opponent card. So imagine they have a Dr. Boom that you don't have an answer to right away. You can just turn that Dr. Boom into a 3/3, making it far less scary, removing like 4/4 in stats. Or maybe you do it to a Deathwing and you remove 9/9 in stats. So the value of Keeper of Uldaman continues to increase in those cases. She's maybe like a kind of a different Aldor Peacekeeper in a way that's a little bit more flexible. I think flexibility is generally good for good players, and I wouldn't be surprised if this card saw some experimentation. Its biggest problem is that it's 4 mana, and Paladin already has so many strong 4 mana cards. All their good cards are 4 mana already. So who knows? It's going to be good in Arena either way. Maybe it's good in mid-range Paladin constructed decks, but even then it probably can't carve out a spot for itself at the extremely valuable 4 mana slot. I'd like to see it played, though. I think it's a really neat design. Up next is the Probably the cutest card in Hearthstone, the Murloc Tiny Fin. This is the Wisp of Murlocs. Just a 0-mana 1/1. Murlocs decks like to get Murlocs out onto the board early, and this one allows you to do that. You can basically dump your hand of Murlocs. I think this will be played in Murloc decks. People are going to be trying Murloc decks because there's so many new Murlocs and Murloc synergy cards. Murloc Tiny Fin is going to be a part of it. No one's going to want to kill this cute face, but they're going to have to from time to time. It's not by normal merit. It's a great card, but it's a playable card despite that. We will see Murloc Tiny Fin in decks. Up next is the Mounted Raptor. It's a 3-mana Druid Beast, which is nice. Druids need more beasts to really make the beast deck a thing. This is a 3/2 for 3, which isn't that exciting. Stats are a little weak. It's very, very susceptible, but has a really powerful Death Rattle. Summon a random 1-cost minion. There really aren't too many bad 1-cost minions in the game. They're all going to give you a little bit of extra value. I don't know what the average stat allocation is, but it's probably about 2/1. So this is kind of like a 5/3 for 3, which is pretty good, especially since the stats are split across 2 bodies. And Druids benefit greatly from leaving things on the board thanks to Savage Roar combos. I think Mounted Raptor is really good. I think it's a solid 3-drop. Druids don't have a lot of great 3-drops anyway. This card will see experimentation, maybe even in normal Druid decks, and definitely in Beast Druid decks, where it's going to be pretty solid to fill out the curve. Another Druid card at the 4-mana slot, also a Beast. This is the Jungle Moonkin. It's a 4/4 for 4. Oops, excuse me. And both players have spell damage +2. So the cool thing about that is a lot of decks don't really benefit from spell damage that much. So if you're designing your deck to benefit from spell damage, that symmetrical effect is probably going to be in your favor most of the time, which is nice. Plus you can control when it happens and combo it out with spells as needed. So the downside of the other guy having spell damage +2 is probably far less than the upside of you having it. The 4/4 for 4 is not the best stats ever. 4/5 would be nice, but it's still fine. It can do work as a 4/4 for 4. And it's a beast, so it unlocks some beast synergies and Beast Druid, which appears is going to be a thing. Might be a good thing even. So just imagine this with like a swipe, for instance, an 8-mana play here. Spell damage +2 makes your swipe do 6/3. It hits the main target for 6 and everything else for 3. That's like a full board wipe against almost everything, right? You can clear a lot of stuff. So Jungle Moonkin's an exciting card to me. It has potential. It's kind of like an alternative to Azure Drake. But I still think Azure Drake's going to be better in mid-range Druid just because the card draw is so valuable. But this gives you some flexibility in that slot, and especially in Beast Druid decks. So Jungle Moonkin is definitely interesting. And then there was the 2-mana Museum Curator. I just don't think this is a good card. As a 1/2 for 2, the stats are just miserable. He doesn't do anything. It doesn't trade into anything well. It dies to 1-drops. Can't kill other 2-drops. That's a miserable stat. It's fine, I guess, if it's a buff body. If you use it with like a Power Word Shield or Velen's Chosen, it starts to be decent. But even the Battlecry Discover a Death Rattle card, I don't know how good that is. There's a lot of Death Rattle cards. Most of them are pretty good. Some aren't. Who knows what mana cost it's going to be. The fact that you get to choose between 3 is probably good. But again, it's kind of a novice engineer that's slightly better in stats, but has random effects and is a little worse in the late game, so, and a little more unreliable. So I don't think Museum Curator is good. I think it's a pretty weak card. But I'd like to be surprised. Up next is the 1-mana spell Raven Idol for Druids. This has an option. You can choose one, discover a minion, or discover a spell. I like card cycles in general just because they thin out your deck, meaning you can get to the good stuff faster. And this one does allow you some choice, right? So it could be really good just because you can narrow down what you're looking for on so many levels. You can look for a damage spell, for instance, if you're desperate for damage. You can look for a minion if you need a body on the board. And once you choose that level, you also get to choose which minion or which spell you're getting. So there's a good chance you're going to find something you want. Druids don't always have a good turn 1 play, so even then it could be good. It's great in the late game to dig for cards. Miracle Druid has been a thing in the past where you need a lot of spells that are cheap to counter to combo off Gadget and Auctioneer. So maybe Miracle Druid gets better with this kind of card. I don't know. Raven Idol's a good card. I don't see a spot for it in most Druid decks right now, but it's got a really strong effect and it's cheap. So who knows what this card has in its future? It might be very valuable sometime. Up next is another 1-mana card. This time it's the Warlock minion Reliquary Seeker. It's just a 1/1, but it has a battle cry. If you have 6 other minions, gain +4/+4. A 1-mana 1/1 is not good. It's fine. The battle cry is crazy. A 1-mana 5/5 is absurd. Unfortunately, the conditions on this battle cry are nuts. No one ever has 6 minions on the board, or almost never. It's so rare that I just don't think it's ever going to hit. It's taking up a slot in your card. You could have a Flame Imp instead, which is a 3/2. It's much more reliable. This is awful on turn 1. It just fills in your mana slots later on. It keeps you from floating a mana. Even on turn 5, an extra 5/5 is not like game winning. I think this is a pretty bad card. It's a gimmick, it's fun, people enjoy experimenting with it, there'll be some nice highlight videos, but it's not going to impact the metagame in any way. Up next is the 7-mana warrior card, Obsidian Destroyer. It's a 7/7 for 7. It's like a War Golem, Dr. Boom. But its effect is, at the end of your turn, summon a 1/1 Scarab with Taunt. That's actually pretty good. It's like a Hogger with some different stats and mana cost, and you can play 2 of them. It's not as good as like Dr. Boom or other 7-drops in the game, so it's not something that's going to replace cards and control warrior, I don't think, but it's interesting in taunt warrior decks if those are a thing. It's great in arena, just absurd in arena. Fantastic arena card again for warriors, so Blizzard has apparently heard that complaint to some extent. It's good for budget players if they unlock League of Explorers and don't have a lot of warrior cards and need some meat at the end of their deck. It's going to be strong there, but in typical constructed play, Obsidian Destroyer is just not good enough to do much. It won't affect the meta at all. Up next is the neutral minion Naga Sea Witch. This is a 5/5 for 5, and your cards cost 5. 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5. Lots of 5s. 5s everywhere. This is basically Druid's Aviana, but with a much worse effect. Aviana doesn't even see play in a deck or in a class that's very good for Aviana. She's very rarely ever included in Druid. This is a worse version of Aviana, and no other classes would benefit Aviana more than Druid. So Naga Sea Witch to me is just bad. Nothing exciting about her stats. They're fine. She'd be fine in Arena, honestly. But in Constructed, there's just no value here. Best case scenario, you play Naga Sea Witch and like a Ysera for 5 mana on the same turn. So it's just netting you an extra 5/5 in stats. But that's usually not that valuable. And to take up a card slot with Naga Sea Witch just doesn't seem worthwhile to me. The potential only exists in really, really late game control decks. It's really bad in aggressive decks. It will hurt you more than it helps. She's just not good. Just kind of a throwaway card. Up next is Pit Snake. This is a rogue card. It's a 1-mana 2/1. Destroy any minion damaged by this minion. So that's a powerful effect that's seen on a few different cards, none of which are played regularly and constructed really even that good. It will be fine in Arena, just as a 2/1 for 1. The effect will be good in Arena as well sometimes, just because opponents won't always have a way to remove this if they don't have a ping hero power. In Constructed, I don't think it's going to be good. It might be okay in Aggro Rogues, just as another 2/1 for 1. that could impact the game later on, just like clearing a taunt or something. But since it doesn't have stealth, it's a little worse than Patient Assassin. It's a beast, which is intriguing. Beast Rogue is not a thing, and I don't think it's going to be a thing. But you'll remember the Mounted Raptor for Druids did occasionally summon a 1-drop when it dies that could be Pit Snake. So if that happens for Beast Druids, who knows? That's pretty amazing. This might just be a throw-in for Druids more than Rogues. I don't see the value for Rogue, so it's okay, but it's not game-changing at all. Up next is Reno Jackson, the dude with the biggest chin in the history of Hearthstone. He's a 6-mana 4/6. It has a really cool battle cry. If your deck contains no more than one of any card, fully heal your hero. That's right, if you're at 1 health, Reno Jackson has the potential to shoot you all the way back up to 30, which is the nightmare for face hunters all over the world. But it's got a really big condition on that battle cry, right? Basically, all of the cards remaining in your deck, there can't be 2 of any given card. If you have 2 of any card, it won't work. So you can't have 2 SI7 agents. You can't have 2 shield maidens. You can't have 2 sledge belchers. You can only have 1 of each. So there are 2 ways to do that, right? One is to build a deck that doesn't have duplicates of anything, and then you can guarantee Reno Jackson's effect going off, which is an intriguing premise. I haven't really looked closely to see how hard that is. I feel like it's tough to assemble a deck without duplicates of any card just because so many cards are too good to only have 1 of. But it might be possible in like Priest or Control Warrior, slow decks like that. The other is to just save Reno Jackson until the end of the game, right? Which is when you might need the heal in like a long, drawn-out fatigue-style battle. So that means he's decent in control-type decks. Probably not as good against aggressive decks just because it's hard to trigger him. Who knows when you're going to draw him. The heal is unreliable. Yeah, it'll shut out face hunters when it happens, but when will it happen? You're sacrificing quite a bit at the mana cost. You could play a Sylvanas instead. You know, there's a lot of better 6-drops out there than just a straight 4/6. So I think problems with reliability, deck design, and poor stat allocation make Reno Jackson a weak card with a really neat effect. It's possible to design a deck that just totally shuts out aggro with Reno Jackson, but I don't see that being a thing. Up next is the Shaman card, Rumbling Elemental. This is a 4-mana 2/6. This card to me is just kind of all over the place, and that's why it's not that good. 2/6 is not a good body. It doesn't trade that well into stuff. It's awkward stats. A 4/5 or something would be better. Maybe even a 4/4 would be better. A 3/5 would be better. There's a lot of different ways to do these stats that would be better. And the effect, while strong, anytime you can deal 2 damage, it's like a super knife juggler, for instance. It needs Battlecry to work, and not that many Shaman cards with Battlecry, and like you're limiting the deck design options you have to use this card effectively. It just feels like this card does so many different things, and none of them are all that exciting. It's not bad necessarily, it just doesn't feel like it does one good thing. So I don't see Rumbling Elemental finding a home anywhere. Up next is another new neutral legendary. This is Sir Finley Murgleton. I hope you like that. Murgleton. I'm not very good at Murlocs. But he's pretty neat. He's a 1-mana 1/3 Murloc. With a Battlecry, discover a new basic hero power. So my assumption is that means just you get 3 random choices from all the standard classes. You might get armor up and priest heal and druids damage and armor, maybe a rogue weapon. You know, who knows what you're going to get. You get to pick whichever one you like best. So I think that makes him probably best in Shaman just because they have one of the most unreliable hero powers and they might want to upgrade, especially in a Murloc design deck. Might even be good in Shaman anyway, just to give them a more consistent hero power option right from the start of the game. But as a Murloc alone, Sir Finley Murgleton is intriguing just because he's got a really nice body for his cost. So on turn 1, it's really hard for people to deal with a 3 health minion, which sets him up really nicely to receive buffs from your future Murloc plays. So he's great for Murloc synergy. I honestly think he gives Murloc decks like a whole new breath of life just because of his stats. Like, it gives them a more consistent way to start games more often. So I like that. The Battlecry is nice. I think Sir Finley Murgleton's simply just a good card. Not to mention downright awesome looking with the monocle and the hat and the machete. And he's a Murloc wearing pants. So I think this is a win-win-win card all the way across the board. And then there was the 5-mana Summoning Stone. Whenever you cast a spell, summon a random minion of the same cost. This is a 0/6 neutral minion. I don't think this is a good card. Of course, the stats are awful. It doesn't trade in anything on its own. It requires a lot of mana to make this card do anything. When it does do stuff, it's going to be good just because you're doubling the value of all your mana expenditures. The problem is that opponents can basically clear this for free without any downsides. Like, if they trade minions into it, right, it's not going to be hurting them. So it's intriguing as like a turn 10 play if you play with like a Fireball and you get an extra minion out of it. You might get a Water Elemental for 5 mana, essentially, the cost of this, along with the fact that they have to remove this, so it's kind of got taunt in a way. It's intriguing. I think it's just too slow for most mage decks to care about. It might see playing like a grinder-style late-game control mage, but otherwise, I think Summoning Stone is probably just going to be relegated to the sidelines as kind of a gimmicky card. I'd like to be surprised, though, because it does have a really powerful effect, and powerful effects, despite first impressions, can open up synergies that we don't see right away. So it'll be fun to see this one experimented with. Up next is a Paladin Secret for 1 mana, as they all are. It's the Sacred Trial. Whenever your opponent has at least 3 minions and plays another, destroy it. I think that's just a very bad card. I'll just say it. It's a bad card. If your opponent has 3 minions already, you're already losing the game. And then playing a 4th one is probably not going to help that much. Plus, it's pretty easy for people to play around most of the time. It does a lot for 1 mana if it destroys like a Kel'Thuzad, sure, but most of the time it won't be doing that, and you're just giving up a valuable card slot in your deck for a weak secret. In Secret Paladin, it's fine, I guess, since Secret Paladin's ridiculous anyway. You're not really sacrificing anything to play it, but even then it won't hit that often in Secret Paladin. It won't really add much value, so at the very best, it might just confuse opponents and make them think a little bit and have tougher decisions. But as an effect, I think Sacred Trial is pretty weak. And then there was the 4-mana rogue card, Tomb Pillager. I think this one is pretty exciting. It's a 5/4 minion with a really cool death rattle. Add a coin to your hand. A 5/4 for 4 is great. It's a little bit susceptible to trades, but it's a very threatening body that will force a reaction from your opponents, which is something Rogue needs. They value damage. So this is a fine stat allocation for them. And the Death Rattle's just really good. Coins for Rogues are fantastic. They love spells, especially spells that give them mana flexibility to play with and are easy to trigger for combos. So I think Tomb Pillager is going to be a valuable Rogue addition. I think he fits in different kinds of Rogue decks, and people will like to see this card in their hand just because of the options that he provides. He's going to be a good card. It's something Rogues needed. They don't have a really good 4-drop right now. In fact, they don't have hardly any 4-drop minions that are worth playing. So this might be the first one. It's also just downright fantastic in Arena. So Rogues will continue to get a little bit better in Arena, which isn't necessarily needed, but it's nice for Rogue Arena players. Up next is the 4-mana Tomb Spider. This is a neutral beast, a 4-mana 3/3. Its battle cry is Discover a Beast. This is kind of like an alternate dimension Gnomish Inventor. Much like the Jeweled Scarab was kind of an alternate dimension Novice Engineer. This is a new take on Gnomish Inventor. In other words, it has 6 total in stats, and its battle cry is essentially draw a card. The difference is that this one has Beast Synergy, unlike Gnomish Inventor, and a different stat alignment. But unfortunately, I think a 3-3 for 4 is probably worse than a 2-4 for 4. And adding a beast is fine, but not particularly exciting. I don't think this is a good card. It's just too slow for hunters. It's also just too weak for druids, which are the typical beast classes. It'll be fine in arena, but even then it's not very good. I think Tomb Spider on average is just a weak card. It won't be doing much. Up next is another rogue card, the 3-mana Unearthed Raptor. This is a 3-mana 3/4. It has a battle cry, choose a friendly minion, and gain a copy of its Death Rattle effect. I think this card is actually insane. I think it's really, really good. 3-mana 3/4 is good anyway, right? It's just a good stat allocation. Trades well. It's a strong body on turn 3. But this battle cry, the potential's nuts. It's say you play a Haunted Creeper on turn 2 and then Unearthed Raptor on turn 3 and you copy the Haunted Creeper's Death Rattle effect. It's a good play. You give this card the Death Rattle summon 2 1/1 minions, which means you get 5, 6 in stat value across 3 bodies for 3 mana. That's nuts. It's really good. But imagine you play this on turn 9 with a Sylvanas Windrunner. And suddenly they have 2 Sylvanas to deal with, because nobody cares about the 5/5 body on Sylvanas. It's the effect. Imagine you play it with a Piloted Shredder. Imagine you play it with a Piloted Sky Golem. There's a lot of good Death Rattle cards. And I think this could even unlock an entirely new archetype for Rogue, where you just have a load of Death Rattles and ways to trigger them. And I don't think that we're too far away from a Death Rattle control style Rogue, because this card is good enough to unlock some pretty crazy combos to me. It's also just going to be good in Arena for Rogues. So Rogues are getting even better in Arena, as we saw with the previous card and this one. Unearthed Raptor is a really strong card. Up next is the 6-mana Wobbling Runts, another card with hilarious artwork. Hearthstone's really taking things to another level when it comes to artwork, but this time I'm not sure the card is quite so good. It's a 6-mana 2/6, and it has the Death Rattle summon 3 2/2 runts. So it's kind of like a Savannah High Main, but with the stats all mixed up, right? 2/6 is not exciting at 6 mana. It trades into nothing. It's killed relatively easily. I mean, it's got some survivability, but it won't be trading efficiently into anything. Its Death Rattle is pretty strong. You deposit another 6/6 in stats onto the board, which means you have an 8/14 or 8/12, total stat allocation when it comes to this card, which is good for 6 mana. But the problem is it's just so disparate, and the stats are all hitting at different times, and it's such a slow tempo play that I don't think Wobbling Runts is very good. If it gets played anywhere, maybe it's like Druid, where having 3 2/2s left on the board is very scary for people, and they have some tough decisions to make just because of your Savage Roar combos options. But even then, I don't think it's viable. There's just too many good 6-drops in the game for this to carve out a spot. It will be a pretty decent Arena card. I think it'll be good in Arena, just because so many stats and so many bodies are always valuable to have in Arena. Up next is the 1-mana Tunnel Trog. Whenever you overload, gain +1 attack per locked mana crystal. This is like the Shaman Mana Worm of mages, but it's far worse. Overload is a bad thing generally, so only getting +1 attack for committing yourself to Overload is really not that great. Whereas Mana Worm, for instance, which has the same stats, gets +1 attack for doing something good, which is casting a spell. So you reward yourself by punishing yourself when it comes to Tunnel Trog. Shamans really don't like Overload anyway. It's not a great mechanic, and no one really utilizes it. So I don't think this is going to open up overload decks. It's just not strong enough to do that. Doesn't enable any new synergies or options. And really aggressive Shaman decks, maybe there's something to happen with Tunnel Trog, but even then I think there are better alternatives. So I think this is a very weak card, which is unfortunate because Shaman needed something a little stronger. Just don't think it's that good. Even with Totem Golem or like the Wolves or Lightning Bolt. I'm trying to think of early overload cards. It just doesn't do enough. It's just not impactful. You might maybe turn it into a 3/3 for 1 mana. And then you look over at Warlock and they've got Flame Imp and you're like, well, that wasn't that great, was it? I committed myself to a 4 mana penalty for very little return. Tunnel Trog is just not going to do much. And it looks like that's it. Those are all the League of Explorer cards. So that wasn't too bad. We made some pretty good time there. I really do appreciate you taking the time to listen to my card review. I hope you learned a little bit, seen some synergies you maybe didn't consider, some card effects and how they worked. I think League of Explorers is on average a solid adventure. The card set is probably not going to have any totally meta-changing decks show up because of it. But I think some cards are good enough to carve out slots in current deck archetypes and maybe change the state of the meta a little. Like we might see a couple decks rise, a couple decks fall, some shuffling, if you will, of what's good and what's popular, which is always nice. I don't think anything revolutionary will happen, but a nice freshening of the meta will be greatly appreciated, and I think that's something League of Explorers has to offer. Plus, it's always just fun playing through these adventures and unlocking the cards. I recommend it. Even if you're not looking for the cards themselves to improve your constructed play, just getting the expansion, enjoying the experience, and having some flexibility in your collection is always a nice thing to have. So, good luck out there with League of Explorers. I hope you enjoy these cards as much as I will. I think there are some great ones. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to the review with me. If you have any questions, please do leave them in the comments. I'd be happy to discuss cards, hear your thoughts. If you think I'm totally wrong or crazy, call me out and let me know. If you think I missed something, I'd be happy to hear it. I'd like to discuss it because I think this is a great way to explore cards and discover what they have to offer. You notice I use the keyword discover there. So again, thanks for watching. Feel free to subscribe or like if you enjoyed the content. Thanks for your time, and until next time, game on.